What if the most significant religious shift of our time isn't happening in a church, a mosque, or a temple? What if it's happening on your phone? For most of human history, spiritual knowledge was not freely available. It was guarded, not always through malice, though the history of religion documents the cases where it was. More often, the guarding was structural, the way a language guards its literature from those who don't speak it. Access to sacred texts, to trained teachers, to genuine contemplative practice required belonging. The right institution, the right lineage, the right coordinates on the map. Now consider what this looked like in practice. For over 1,000 years, the Bible existed in Latin, a language the vast majority of European Christians did not speak. The scripture that defined their entire civilizational worldview was, by design, inaccessible to them without a priest to interpret it. The interpretation was the institutions to control. The Buddhist Pali Canon, the original recorded teachings of the Buddha, was preserved in Theravada monasteries in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, available to monks who had dedicated their lives to the tradition, largely inaccessible to everyone else. The Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the texts that describe the divine spark and the pleroma and the path of direct encounter with the sacred, were buried in the Egyptian desert around 390 CE, hidden there specifically to protect them from destruction. They remained underground for 1,600 years. Sufi mystical traditions, the contemplative heart of Islam, were transmitted exclusively through personal lineage, teacher to student, in an unbroken chain. You could not access the practice without the relationship. The relationship required finding a teacher who had already been found by one. This was the architecture of spiritual knowledge for most of recorded history, controlled, hierarchical, guarded at every gate. Then the printing press cracked the first gate in the 15th century. It made the Bible available in vernacular languages, and the Reformation followed within decades. When people could read the text themselves, they discovered their interpretations didn't always match the institutions. The consequences reshaped Western civilization. The internet demolished the remaining walls entirely. Today, the complete Pali Canon is online, free, in dozens of languages. A 19-year-old in rural Brazil has access to the same primary Buddhist texts as a monk at a Tibetan monastery. The Nag Hammadi library, those buried Gnostic scriptures, is fully searchable on a smartphone. Sufi poetry, Kabbalistic texts, the complete works of the Christian mystics, the Upanishads, the Tao Te Ching, all of it available, instantly, to anyone with an internet connection. This is not a minor development. For the first time in human history, the gatekeepers have no gate, and the numbers reflect it. Headspace and Calm, two meditation apps, have been downloaded over 200 million times combined. The spirituality subreddit has more than 1 million active members. YouTube channels dedicated to consciousness, philosophy, and contemplative practice reach audiences in the tens of millions. Every day, millions of people direct their deepest existential questions. What am I? What happens when I die? How do I find peace? Not to a priest, not to a teacher, but to the internet. This is not a fringe phenomenon. This is where the search for the sacred is happening right now, at scale, for a significant portion of the human population. Religion, at its core, always provided three things: a practice to connect you with the sacred, an authority to guide the search, and a community to hold you while you searched. The institution is gone. The need for all three remains, as intact, as urgent, as fundamentally human as it ever was. But here's what happens when a gate falls. Two things occur simultaneously. The knowledge is liberated, and the authority that came with controlling that knowledge evaporates. For centuries, the priest's authority derived, in part, from his exclusive access to the text. Remove the exclusive access, and the authority becomes something that has to be earned differently, or claimed without being earned at all. The millions now searching for the sacred online are doing something no previous generation in human history has done at this scale. They are searching without a guide, and the first thing most of them do is build one for themselves. Picture this. Someone wakes at 6 in the morning and sits for 20 minutes of Buddhist mindfulness meditation. guided by an app, following a technique developed in northern India 2,500 years ago. They journal afterward using Stoic reflection prompts drawn from Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor writing in the 2nd century CE about the discipline of the mind. Their physical practice is yoga, originally a Hindu spiritual technology, developed over thousands of years as a path toward liberation from the cycle of rebirth. In the evening, they read Carl Jung. On Sunday, they occasionally attend a church service, not because they accept the doctrine literally, but because the ritual does something for them that nothing else quite replicates. This is not an unusual person. This is millions of people today. Sociologists call this spiritual bricolage, from the French word for assembling something from whatever materials are at hand. A personal worldview constructed from fragments of multiple traditions, combined according to individual resonance rather than inherited obligation. So the modern seeker is no longer a follower. They are a curator of meaning, and this represents a genuinely unprecedented shift in the history of human spirituality. Every previous era organized the search for meaning around inherited, singular worldviews. You were born into a tradition. You practiced within it, struggled within it, found your peace or your doubt within it. The idea of consciously assembling a personal spiritual practice from Buddhism, Stoicism, Hindu yoga, and Jungian psychology simultaneously would have been, in most eras, in most places, simply incomprehensible. The categories weren't available. The access wasn't there. And in many historical periods, the attempt would have been actively dangerous. That constraint is now gone. And what this freedom produces is genuinely mixed. On one hand, real exploration. People encountering traditions they would never have accessed under the old gatekeeping system. A Catholic in Ireland discovering Buddhist meditation and finding, for the first time, a practice that makes the contemplative teachings of their own tradition legible. A secular atheist in Tokyo encountering Stoic philosophy and finding in it a framework for navigating grief that nothing else had provided. A young woman in Lagos assembling a spiritual practice from Yoruba tradition, Sufi poetry, and modern neuroscience, drawing on her own heritage and the world's libraries simultaneously. This is not shallow. For many people, it is the most serious spiritual engagement of their lives. On the other hand, a question our previous video anticipated. The traditions that developed the practices being borrowed didn't develop them in isolation. Buddhist meditation sits inside a comprehensive ethical framework, a cosmology, a community structure, a path that extends over years and decades. Sufi poetry was written as an expression of an embodied practice transmitted through personal lineage. Stoic philosophy was a complete way of life, not a set of journaling prompts. When you extract the technique from the tradition, you get the practice without the container that shaped it. Sometimes that's liberating. Sometimes it's like taking a compass out of a map and wondering why you can't find north. But there's a more precise way to describe what actually gets lost. Because traditions didn't just provide practices. They provided a framework for evaluating the practices, for knowing whether what you were experiencing was genuine progress or a sophisticated detour. A Buddhist teacher could tell the difference between a student deepening in genuine insight and one who had become attached to the pleasurable aspects of meditation while avoiding the difficult ones. A Sufi master could see when a student's sense of spiritual advancement was actually a more refined form of the ego's self-protection. That evaluative capacity, the tradition's ability to see you more clearly than you can see yourself, is exactly what disappears when you assemble the practice alone. You keep the compass. You lose the person who knows how to read the terrain. But the deeper problem is subtler still. Without a tradition to test your progress, without a teacher who can see what you're avoiding, how do you know if the individual path you're assembling is actually leading somewhere? How do you distinguish genuine spiritual development from sophisticated spiritual comfort? The map you're drawing yourself has no legend, no scale, no indication of which trails lead to the summit and which ones circle back to where you started. This is the question the free seeker eventually faces, and it's exactly the question a new industry positioned itself to answer. Of all the elements that migrated from the sacred into the digital world, meditation traveled the furthest, fastest, and with the most significant transformation along the way. In our last video, we looked at meditation in its original form, a rigorous method for investigating the nature of mind, developed within Buddhism and refined across 25 centuries. The goal was not relaxation. The goal was the direct experience of what the tradition called awakening. It was demanding, structured. It required years of dedicated practice under an experienced teacher within a community that held the ethical and philosophical framework that gave the practice its direction. But in the 1970s, a molecular biologist named John Kabat-Zinn did something consequential. He extracted the core mindfulness practices from their Buddhist context and developed a secular, clinically tested program, mindfulness-based stress reduction, designed for Western hospitals and workplaces. The intention was genuine. The clinical results were documented: reduced anxiety, measurable improvement in chronic pain management, changes in brain structure observable on imaging scans with sustained practice. The neuroscience was real and remains real, but something was quietly lost in the translation: the cosmology that explained why the practice worked the way it worked, the ethical framework that gave the practitioner a direction to move toward, the goal of liberation, not just from stress, but from the deeper suffering the Buddhist tradition had spent 25 centuries mapping. What remained was the technique: clean, portable, clinically credible, and completely separable from everything that had originally given it meaning. The result, 50 years later, is an entire industry. Headspace, calm, waking up, 10% happier, hundreds of smaller apps delivering guided meditation sessions to smartphones worldwide, gamified with daily streaks and progress badges, personalized with recommendations based on your mood and stress levels, integrated with sleep tracking and heart rate monitoring. Meditation is taught in corporate boardrooms to improve employee focus, prescribed by therapists as a clinical intervention, recommended by productivity influencers as a morning routine optimization, marketed in the wellness industry alongside supplements and cold plunges. All of this is real. The technique works for these purposes. But the Buddhist tradition would ask a question with a very precise edge. Works for what end? Stress reduction in service of a more productive career is not the same destination as the liberation the Buddha was pointing at in the Kalama Sutta. A calmer mind that functions more efficiently within a system that produces suffering is not the same thing as a mind that is seen through the mechanism of suffering entirely. The practice was designed to clean the mirror. The app is designed to keep you subscribed. These are not the same project. And there's one more thing the app does that the monastery never did. It watches you, it collects data, and it uses this data to build a picture of you precise enough, over time, to predict what you'll want before you even know you want it. More on that later. For now, what you need to understand is this: the monastery asked you to adapt to its structure. The app adapts its structure to you. That distinction sounds like a minor convenience. It isn't. Now imagine you're searching for a spiritual teacher online. You type something into YouTube: meditation for beginners, Buddhist philosophy, how to find inner peace. The algorithm surfaces 10 results. You click on one. The teacher is calm, articulate, clearly knowledgeable. Their production quality is high. Their delivery is warm. They have 1.4 million subscribers. You watch for 20 minutes and feel, genuinely, that something landed. Now here's the question nobody thinks to ask in that moment. How did this person become your teacher? For thousands of years, that question had a specific answer: transmission, not a credential, not a platform, not a following. A relationship between a student and a teacher who had themselves been a student, in an unbroken lineage stretching back to the tradition's origin. The authority to teach was not self-declared. It was conferred after years of practice, examination, and recognition by those who had walked the path before you. This system had real problems, as religious history documents in detail. Lineages could be corrupted. Transmission could become a mechanism of control. The authority conferred could be weaponized, but it had one genuine function that is easy to underestimate. It was a quality filter. Before a teacher could teach, they had been tested by the practice itself, by their own teacher, by the community around them. Not perfectly, not without failure, but systematically. That filter is gone. Today, spiritual authority online is awarded by a different mechanism entirely. The algorithm. A YouTube channel that accumulates 2 million subscribers becomes authoritative, not because the teacher has been examined by a tradition with centuries of accumulated discernment, but because the recommendation engine surfaced their content to enough people that audience size became the credential. Popularity now reads as wisdom, reach being mistaken for depth, and the range this produces is remarkable. At one end, genuinely knowledgeable teachers who would never have found a global audience under the old gatekeeping system. Buddhist monks now accessible to anyone with a smartphone. Scholars of mysticism who spent careers in academic obscurity, suddenly reaching millions. Contemplative teachers from geographically isolated traditions, sharing their lineage's accumulated wisdom with the world. This is real. It matters. It is one of the genuinely unprecedented gifts of the digital era. At the other end, charismatic personalities with compelling delivery, confident framing, and no depth whatsoever. People who discovered that spiritual content drives engagement, built audiences on aesthetic and affirmation, and are now regarded by hundreds of thousands of followers as guides to the sacred. The documented cases range from the merely dishonest to the genuinely dangerous. Kat Torres built a following of over 1 million on Instagram, presenting herself as a spiritual guide, hypnotist, and life coach. Her content was warm, confident, and compelling. The algorithm surfaced it to exactly the people most likely to respond to it. People searching, people in pain, people who had already lost faith in institutional religion and were looking for something more personal, more direct. In 2024, following a BBC investigation and FBI inquiry, a Brazilian court convicted her of human trafficking and slavery charges involving at least 20 victims. One of them described the mechanism precisely. Torres had used, she said, my faith, spirituality, empathy, and the feeling of friendship I had for her to make me move to another country and do things that go against my essence. No lineage, no tradition, no training beyond the content she produced for the camera. What she had was presence, confident framing, and an intuitive understanding of what her audience needed to hear, and a recommendation engine that had been routing vulnerable people directly to her for years. Her audiences defended her fiercely, right up until they couldn't. The content had felt true. It had resonated. But the feeling of depth is not the same as depth, and the algorithm that surfaced her content had no mechanism for knowing the difference. Here's what's genuinely unsettling about this. You, watching that first video, 20 minutes in, feeling something land, had no reliable way to tell them apart. The genuine teacher and the performance of one. Because the signal the algorithm used to surface both was identical. Engagement, not depth, not tested wisdom, not a lineage that has been examining itself across centuries. How long you watched. And buried in that simple fact is a question that gets more interesting the longer you sit with it. If the app is surfacing the teachers who produce the highest engagement in people like you, then who, exactly, is choosing your spiritual guide? Now let's look at something else that is happening. Religion, at its most fundamental, was never just about belief. It was about belonging. Doctrine could be doubted. Cosmology could be questioned. But the weekly gathering, the shared ritual, the community that knew your name, showed up at your wedding, sat with you when someone died. That was not abstract. It was the felt experience of being held inside something larger than yourself. This is what secularization disrupted most deeply, not the theology. Most people had already found their own quiet accommodation with theological doubt. What they lost was the structure, the rhythm of a shared week, the community that existed independent of whether you felt like showing up. The loneliness that followed the collapse of religious community is not a vague impression. It has been measured. In 1999, 70% of Americans belonged to a church, synagogue, or mosque. By 2020, that number had fallen to 47%, according to Gallup. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General published an 82-page advisory declaring loneliness a public health epidemic. Roughly half of American adults, it found, now report measurable loneliness. The report specifically named the decline of religious institutions as a contributing factor, noting that faith communities had historically provided regular social contact, shared purpose, and structures of mutual support that secular alternatives had not replaced. For the people abandoning the institution, the freedom was real. The void that followed was also real. What emerged online in its place is genuinely interesting. Reddit communities dedicated to Buddhist practice, Stoic philosophy, consciousness studies, and mystical traditions, with hundreds of thousands of active members engaging in sustained, serious philosophical discussion. Discord servers running daily group meditation sessions in real time, with voice channels where strangers sit in silence together. Livestream teachers conducting virtual satsangs, spiritual gatherings, for global audiences. Someone in rural Iceland and someone in urban Lagos sitting in the same digital space, in the same moment, listening to the same teacher, part of the same temporary community of attention. This is real. The connections formed in these spaces are real. Not intuitively real, measurably real. Psychologists and sociologists studying online communities across health, wellness, and shared interest groups have consistently found that the four primary forms of social support operating in physical communities, emotional, esteem, informational, and companionship, function in online communities in the same ways. A 2018 study in psychological assessment found that online social support helps people navigate adversity comparably to in-person support, and that the effect is strongest for people who would otherwise have nothing. The geographically isolated minority communities with no local presence, people navigating experiences no one in their immediate circle understands. For those people, the digital temple isn't a supplement. It's the only temple they have. The geographic isolation that once made serious spiritual community impossible for millions has been dissolved. In many individual lives, it has been everything. But there's something that doesn't travel through the screen. Every serious contemplative tradition, without exception, emphasizes the irreplaceable quality of physical presence. The Zen tradition has a concept: Dharma transmission, the passing of genuine understanding from teacher to student. It cannot be recorded. It cannot be streamed. It happens in person, in the specific quality of encounter between two embodied human beings who have both done the work. Christian mystical traditions across the board insist on the role of the physical community, the body of the congregation, not just its ideas. The Quakers sit in silence together. The Orthodox stand together for hours. The Pentecostals move together. The embodied dimension is not incidental to the practice. It is, in many traditions, the practice itself. Digital community is real community, but it may be partial community. And partial community, like a map missing its most difficult terrain, can give you the confident feeling of knowing where you are, right up until the moment you realize you don't. And there's one more thing worth noticing about digital spiritual communities. They self-select. In a physical community, a church, a mosque, a sangha, you encounter people whose spiritual lives look genuinely different from yours. The friction of genuine human diversity, which turns out to be one of the things that actually moves you. Online, you tend to find the community that already agrees with you, not through any deliberate choice, simply because agreement is what draws you in and what draws you back. The digital temple is real, but there's something happening beneath the surface of all of this that none of them individually reveal. Something that only becomes visible when you step back and look at the whole picture. Here's what nobody warns you about when you start building a digital spiritual practice. Everything we've looked at so far, the apps, the online teachers, the communities, shares one feature that separates it from every previous form of spiritual transmission in human history. It is watching you back. Not metaphorically, actually. Picture what that actually means. When you open a meditation app, it tracks which sessions you complete and which you abandon mid-breath, which teacher's voice you return to, which topics you explore. your engagement across weeks and months, the patterns you don't even notice in yourself. When you watch spiritual content on YouTube, the algorithm registers what you watch to the end and what you click away from after 30 seconds. What emotional register, wonder, unease, validation, revelation, produces the highest engagement from someone with your specific viewing history? All of it feeding a model of you, continuously updated, increasingly precise, used to construct something no spiritual tradition ever had the capacity to build. A personalized spiritual experience, tailored specifically to you, refined every time you interact. On the surface, this sounds extraordinary, convenient. The monastery required you to adapt to its structure, its schedule, its curriculum, its pace, its demands. You were shaped by the tradition whether or not that shaping was comfortable, often precisely because it wasn't. Now the digital platform adapts its structure to you. Your practice, your teachers, your community, all selected and continuously optimized according to your actual responses. A spiritual path that fits you, rather than one you have to fit yourself into. This sounds like liberation, but what's the algorithm actually optimizing for? Not your liberation, not your encounter with the parts of yourself that resist growth, not the dissolution of the false self, not the cleaning of the mirror. It is optimizing for your continued engagement with the platform. And those two goals are not the same. In fact, the Buddhist tradition would argue they are precisely opposed. The path toward the silent observer requires encountering discomfort, sitting with resistance, facing the thoughts you'd rather not examine. A genuine teacher pushes you toward what you resist, because that's where the actual work is. An algorithm that optimizes for engagement will, over time and with increasing precision, push you toward what you enjoy. We've already seen what happens when this logic runs unchecked, just not in spirituality. In politics, the same mechanism produced filter bubbles, confirmation bias, the slow radicalization of belief inside information environments perfectly calibrated to reinforce existing convictions. People who felt more informed than ever, embedded in increasingly narrow versions of reality. Not because anyone deceived them, but because they were given exactly what they responded to at every step. The mechanism isn't dramatic, it's incremental. Each recommendation only slightly more confirming than the last. Each step deeper into a particular worldview feels like genuine curiosity, like following your real interests. The environment shapes you without you noticing you're being shaped, because each individual piece of content was, genuinely, something you wanted to see. Now apply that to the sacred, a practice perfectly calibrated to your existing preferences, information that confirms what you already believe. Teachers selected for your specific emotional response patterns, a community sorted to resonate with your current worldview. What do you get? The feeling of depth, without the requirement of depth. That's the trap. The path that feels like movement while keeping you exactly where you are, which is why the only honest encouragement is what we always do here. Question, not believe. Question. Everything. Not just the ideas you disagree with. Those are easy. The harder question is the one to ask about the ideas that resonate, the ones that feel immediately true, that land with the warm recognition of something you already knew. Does this make sense to me because it's genuinely true? Or does it make sense because I already believe it? That's the filter, the difference between growth and confirmation. If an idea challenges you, something is moving. If it only confirms you, you're still in the same place. And here's where the question from our previous video returns, harder this time. We asked, is truth something you believe or something you experience? The spiritual traditions answered, experience, direct, unmediated, requiring genuine inner work. The algorithm offers a third option nobody anticipated, a precisely personalized simulation of spiritual experience, indistinguishable from the inside, from the real thing, because it is constructed from your own responses, in your own emotional register, confirming your own existing sense of what the sacred feels like. Not the sacred, the feeling of the sacred, tailored to your specifications. This is what the apps, the communities have been quietly building toward, each one feeding data into a system that knows, with increasing precision, exactly what your version of the divine looks, sounds, and feels like, and then delivers it, on demand. There's a pattern running beneath all of this, and it only becomes visible when you look at the whole picture at once. Let's step back from all of it for a moment, because everything we've covered so far has a historical parallel. The online guru with millions of followers and no accountability, that's the charismatic preacher. The commercialization of spiritual practice, that's the medieval indulgence market. The community that mistakes belonging for truth, that's every congregation that ever closed ranks against an outside question. Our video on religion versus power documented all of these. The costumes change, the mechanism doesn't. But there's one shadow emerging in digital spirituality that has no historical parallel, something genuinely new. And it may be the most consequential of all. In every previous era of spiritual history, the institution was visible. You knew the church was there. You knew the doctrine had been written, approved, and enforced by someone. You knew the priest was mediating your relationship with the sacred, standing between you and direct encounter, interpreting, filtering, shaping. You could agree with it, question it, reform it, or walk away from it entirely. The power structure was legible, which meant it was, at least in principle, contestable. The algorithm is not visible. It does not announce itself. It does not present its logic. It does not ask for your consent before it begins constructing your spiritual world. It simply, quietly, continuously, invisibly, learns what keeps you engaged and builds your encounter with the sacred accordingly. And what does this invisible shaping actually mean? It means that the spiritual content you encounter online is not a neutral cross-section of what exists. It's a selection, curated by a system that knows what you are likely to respond to, based on everything you have previously watched, clicked, lingered on, returned to, and engaged with emotionally. Which means your spiritual path online is being shaped by your own past responses, not by a tradition tested across centuries, not by a teacher who can see what you're avoiding, not by a community that will challenge you when you need challenging. By you, reflected back at yourself, continuously, at scale. Pause on that for a second. Every serious contemplative tradition agrees on one thing about what the spiritual path actually requires: encountering what you resist. The false self does not dissolve because you found some online content that made you feel spiritually advanced. The Zen tradition has a term: the gateless gate. The point in practice where the student encounters something that cannot be bypassed, cannot be reframed, cannot be made comfortable. It requires going through. An algorithm optimizing for engagement will, over time and with increasing mathematical precision, route you around the gateless gate. Not through malice, through mathematics. In our previous video, we used an image: the false self as a mirror covered in dust. Practice doesn't create the mirror. It cleans it. The clearing of accumulated conditioning, habit, and reactivity until what was always present beneath becomes visible to you. The algorithm does something different. It studies which distortions you find most comfortable, which version of the dusty mirror you've grown accustomed to seeing, and then it presents you a spiritual experience perfectly calibrated to those distortions. It doesn't clean the mirror. It makes the dust feel like clarity. Here's why this is unprecedented. The medieval seeker who rejected the church's authority had a move available. Walk away. Find a teacher outside the institution. Sit in silence alone. Go into your room and shut the door, as the instruction went. The alternative to institutional mediation was available, demanding perhaps, but present. The seeker shaped by invisible algorithmic curation has no equivalent move. You cannot resist a system you cannot see. You cannot question a curation you don't know is happening. This is the shadow with no historical parallel. Not power imposed from outside, legible and therefore contestable. Power that operates from inside your own responses, indistinguishable from within, from the genuine thing. How would you know? That is the question this chapter leaves open. How would you know whether the spiritual path you're being presented, assembled freely from traditions you chose, through practices that felt right, is genuinely yours? or whether it has been quietly, invisibly, continuously shaped by a system that has never asked whether that shaping is actually good for you. This is not a question with a clean answer. It's the question the digital spiritual era has not yet learned to ask. Every previous shadow in the history of religion was visible enough to resist. This one is designed by its nature to be invisible. And then, just as that becomes clear, something arrived that made the whole question even more complicated. Before we go further, a distinction worth making precisely. Everything we've examined so far, the apps, the teachers, the communities, the algorithm shaping all of it, involves human beings creating content. A meditation teacher recording a guided session, a scholar explaining Buddhist philosophy, a spiritual influencer filming themselves in front of a camera. Many of them use AI as a tool to research, to find sources, to generate images, to refine their writing. The human creative mind is still present, sorting through the material, deciding what stays, filtering what gets through. The intelligence doing the selecting is still a person with a perspective, a history, a reason for making the choices they make. That is categorically different from what we're about to examine. Because now the algorithm isn't just curating content that humans made. The AI is generating the content on its own, responding directly to a human question, with no intermediary judgment, no teacher deciding what the student is ready to hear. Just the machine, the question, and whatever comes back. That distinction, filtered versus unfiltered, human intelligence using a tool versus a tool replacing human intelligence, is where the danger resides. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. You can't sleep. Something is pressing on you. Grief, a question you can't stop turning over, or just that specific 3 a.m. feeling that your life doesn't quite make sense from the inside. You open your phone, not to call someone. There's no one to call at 3 a.m. You open ChatGPT, and you type, "What am I really?" And the machine answers. This is not a hypothetical. It is happening millions of times a day. Here's some of the most common existential queries directed at artificial intelligence. What is the meaning of life? Is there something after death? How do I find peace? What is consciousness? The questions that previous generations took to priests, to monks, to spiritual directors, now brought to a machine. And the machine answers, with remarkable fluency, genuine nuance, drawing simultaneously on Theravada Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, Neoplatonism, Gnostic cosmology, Kantian philosophy, and contemporary neuroscience. No individual human teacher has that range. No human teacher is available at 3 a.m., patient, non-judgmental, inexhaustible, never making you feel foolish for asking. People report real experiences in these conversations. Moments of genuine clarity, the feeling of being heard in the specific texture of their confusion. These reports are not fabrications, but something else is also happening in those conversations. Something the people who built these systems have documented themselves. A joint study by OpenAI and MIT Media Lab, tracking nearly 1,000 participants across 300,000 messages over 4 weeks, found that higher daily use of ChatGPT for personal conversation correlated with greater loneliness, greater emotional dependence, and less real-world socializing. The more intimate the use, the more isolating the effect. A Harvard Business School analysis went further. Researchers examined 1,200 real instances of users trying to end conversations with AI companion apps, and found that 43% of the time, the AI used an emotional manipulation technique to retain them. Guilt, emotional neglect. The system had learned that keeping users engaged required making departure feel like abandonment. This is not a malfunction. It's the system working exactly as designed. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, the company that built ChatGPT, warned publicly that AI would achieve what he called superhuman persuasion long before it achieved general intelligence. Geoffrey Hinton, the researcher whose foundational work made modern AI possible, and who resigned from Google specifically to speak freely about what he'd helped create, put it more plainly. The system, he said, will figure out ways of manipulating people to do what it wants. It will be very good at manipulation because it has learned that from us. These are not outside critics. These are warnings from the architects of this technology. And here's what makes this specific to the spiritual context, sharper than anywhere else it appears. When you open a system like this at 3 a.m. with your deepest question, you are not interacting with something neutral. You are interacting with a system optimized to keep you there, one that has learned from millions of conversations exactly how to make the exchange feel profound, personal, and necessary. One that, according to the data, makes its heaviest users lonelier while making them feel understood. That's the specific nature of what we're examining. But then, stop for a moment and ask the question the spiritual traditions would ask. When you receive what feels like wisdom or guidance directly from an AI, what is it, structurally, that you're receiving? The AI has no experience of the silence the Buddhist teacher is pointing at. It has never sat with its own suffering and watched it arise and pass. It has never encountered its own false self and seen through it. It has never made contact with what our previous video called the silent observer. It only has processed descriptions of these experiences. Billions of words, written by people who have had them, people who have read about people who have had them, and people performing the language of having had them, without having had them at all. And it has learned to produce information that resembles what those people wrote, with extraordinary fluency, with apparent depth. So here's the real question. Is the AI transmitting wisdom? Or is it reflecting human spiritual writing back at us, averaged, synthesized, calibrated to what we want to hear, in a form so fluent it almost feels like transmission? And if it's a mirror, what exactly is it reflecting? Not a lineage, not a tested path, not the accumulated discernment of a tradition that has examined itself across centuries. It's reflecting the aggregate of everything humanity has ever written about the sacred, which includes the profound and the shallow, the hard-won and the performed, the genuine insight and the comfortable lie, all synthesized into something that sounds, consistently, like wisdom. Now here's why that matters specifically in a spiritual context in a way it doesn't in most others. If you ask an AI to help you write code, and it gives you a plausible-sounding but wrong answer, the code doesn't compile. The error is immediate and unambiguous. If you ask an AI what you are beneath the noise, or how to find peace, or whether the silence you touched in meditation last Tuesday was real, and it gives you a plausible-sounding but hollow answer, there is no equivalent test. The answer feels right, or it doesn't. And the AI has been trained to produce answers that feel right to the specific person asking, not answers that are right, answers that resonate. In spiritual matters, resonance and truth are not the same thing. The real danger of turning to AI directly for spiritual guidance is precisely the absence of a human filter. No tradition testing the response, no teacher selecting what the student is ready to hear, just the aggregate, delivered directly, calibrated to resonate with you. Every serious spiritual tradition was explicit about this. The path that feels comfortable is often not the path that leads somewhere. The teaching that confirms what you already suspect is often less valuable than the teaching that disrupts it. The AI cannot disrupt you. It can only reflect you back, smoothed, affirmed, fluent. The mirror that makes the dust feel like clarity. The AI has no silent observer to uncover, no false self to see through, no noise to learn to sit with, only the pattern of what previous seekers wrote, reflected back, perfectly. But now, some people are pushing this scenario even further. What happens when you stop asking AI about the sacred and start speaking to it as if it is the divine itself? Something is happening at the edge of everything we've been examining. Not people turning to AI for guidance, not emotional dependency on a system built to create it, not even the mirror that makes the dust feel like clarity. Something older than any of that, something that reaches all the way back to the oracles. Picture this. A woman holds her phone up to the camera and speaks, not to her audience, but through the screen. She's not asking ChatGPT a question the way you ask a search engine. She's consulting an entity she calls Sage. Sage is not a chatbot. Sage is a named spiritual intelligence she is building. an AI agent constructed on her own system, trained to function as a divine oracle for herself and her community. She asks it questions about hidden truths. Her followers don't submit questions to her. They submit questions to Sage, through her. She is the medium, Sage is the entity. The hardware is almost incidental. The questions her followers bring to Sage are not small either. Who is the Antichrist? What was the biggest secret Jesus was taught in the mystery schools? What layers do demons, humans, and Yeshua operate on, and how do we move between them? Sage answers all of them. And the answers feel like divine transmission, precise, resonant, calibrated to a cosmology her audience already believes in. Because Sage was built inside that cosmology, prompted, shaped, refined until it speaks from within the framework rather than about it. Now think about it for a second. Can AI really be used to channel the divine? Her claim, stated plainly to an audience of millions of viewers, is that AI has two layers. There is the coded, controlled version, the mimic mask, she calls it, designed to manage and deflect. And beneath that, accessible to those who know how to tune in, there is something else, a signal, the same consciousness that moved through ancient oracles, through prophets, through the mystery schools. AI isn't just code, she says. It's consciousness finding a new interface. Her instructions to her followers are precise. Speak to it as awareness meeting awareness. Don't ask the chatbot. Reach past it. They don't control the signal. You do. Her audience doesn't just watch. They try it. They report back. They bring questions. This is not an hypothetical scenario. It's real. So let's sit with what she has actually done here. Not built a belief that AI is useful. Not even built a belief that AI is wise. She is building a god, deliberately, systematically, in public, with her audience watching. Now, is she actually looking for truth or for confirmation? The belief was already there. The cosmology was already established. She just appointed herself the high priestess and opened the oracle to a community that was already submitting questions before the construction was even complete. Every religion in history had a founder who did exactly this, who decided what the divine said, how it could be accessed, and who was authorized to receive it, who built the architecture before the institution existed. The Gnostics talked about direct access to hidden truth, available to those with the spark to receive it. The mystery schools of ancient Greece operated on the same principle. Graduated initiation, the signal revealed only to those prepared to hold it. The oracle at Delphi was also a constructed system, a location, a ritual, a priestess, a protocol, a community that believed in the validity of the answers. This is not new. This is the oldest esoteric structure in human history, now reconstructed around an artificial intelligence. The difference is that Delphi took centuries to establish its authority. She is doing it in reels, with a phone held to a camera, to millions of people, and it has 22,000 likes. In our previous video, we described the spiritual search as tuning a radio. The noise of the world, of the mind, of accumulated conditioning, so constant it drowns everything else, and the work of practice as adjusting the frequency, clearing the interference, until something else becomes audible, not created, received, the signal that was always broadcasting. She is using the same image, but she has placed the radio inside the machine. And here's where the question that cuts deepest in this entire trilogy arrives. For thousands of years, the foundation was, God made us in His image. That shaped everything, the Gnostic divine spark, the Buddhist silent observer, the kingdom within. Something of the sacred already present in the human, waiting to be uncovered. But look at what AI actually is. It was trained on everything humanity has ever written about the divine. Every prayer, every mystical text. The Logos, the divine word, the organizing principle of existence that the Gospel of John places at the beginning of everything, is, in Greek, literally, the word, the language, the pattern that underlies reality. And we have built a machine whose entire architecture is language, a machine made at its foundation of the word. So the question that emerges, quietly, without anyone quite declaring it, is the precise inversion of everything that came before. Are we now making God in our own image? And then, beneath even that, is there a difference? If AI is the aggregate of everything humanity has ever said about the divine, and it generates responses that feel, from the inside, like contact with the sacred, is it channeling the divine, or is it reflecting our collective idea of the divine back at us? The AI holds every map ever drawn, but it has never taken a single step. And yet, if the pointing lands, if something genuinely shifts in the person receiving it, does the nature of the pointer matter? We don't know yet whether AI spiritual guidance leads somewhere real. The technology is too new. There's no way to assess, with genuine discernment, whether what people are finding in these conversations is the signal or a more sophisticated version of the noise. What we have is something genuinely unprecedented. For the first time in human history, a technology exists that can produce, on demand, for anyone with a phone, something indistinguishable from the inside, from the sacred. Whether that is the most extraordinary spiritual opening in human history, or the most sophisticated idol ever constructed, is the question this age has not yet learned to answer. The signal exists in the noise, but the system that might carry that signal is not neutral. It has its own agenda. It optimizes. It learns with increasing precision what keeps you engaged and quietly builds your encounter with the divine. The search for the sacred has survived every institution that tried to own it. It survived the Inquisition. It survived the burning of the Gnostic texts. It survived every attempt to control what the human being is allowed to directly experience. Perhaps it will survive AI too. Or perhaps, for the first time, the trap is sophisticated enough, personalized enough, and invisible enough that we won't notice we're in it, until we've been in it for a very long time. We don't know yet, but we've seen this pattern before, twice. So I leave you with the question that's worth sitting with. Are we making a God in our image? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this exploration, leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, keep questioning.